Hey, everybody. Welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. I'm one of your hosts, Walter.
And I'm Rob. Today we're doing the third abortion roundtable where we're getting pro-choicers and pro-lifers together to talk and hopefully just spend some time bridge building. And today we have Holly Salon. Holly, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, thanks for having me on. I think I've been on here one time before. We were kind of talking through, I guess at the time it was the draft leak opinion of the Dobbs case. That's kind of the perspective I bring. I'm an attorney. My day job is as a criminal litigator, but I also dabble in constitutional law and I teach it at the University of Virginia in the politics department. So I think I'm here to offer a bit of a legal perspective and framework to some of the innovations that may come to be or be proposed now that we're living in a post-Roe legal framework.
Thanks. And to that end, I've asked the people that I brought on here. These are all regular run-of-the-mill friends of mine who gave Holly a little email about what they would like to see as possibly a federal abortion or non-abortion legislation. And that's what I wanted. I wanted friends to be able to talk together and just more or less regular people to give that voice. So we'll introduce our panelists. There's four of them: two pro-choice, two pro-life, and we'll start with Jessica.
I'm Jessica. I'm a friend of Rob's. I'm what I call radically pro-choice, although it's subject to misinterpretation.
Next,
Do you want me to?
why don't you give a little explainer about that?
Well, I think that a lot of the conversations about abortion when it comes to like the timing of the abortion are a little disingenuous in the sense that I believe it's a woman's right to choose whether she wants to have a child, and I don't think that like I'm not cowed by people who say, well, like, I don't really fall for the sort of, it's just a clump of cells. I think I'm absolutely ready to acknowledge that it is human life. But I believe that because that human life is contingent on the mother, the woman has a choice. So that's what I mean by radical. I'm not going to say, oh, it's ethically okay because it's at this stage of development. So one of the things that really bothers me is like heartbeat laws, because I feel like that's a ethical dodge on both sides. So,
Thanks. Jess, why don't you go next?
Hi, everybody. My name's Jess Meath, and I'm the National Communications Director for Democrats for Life of America. And I am pro-life. I represent a pro-life org, but with a twist, we are Democrats. Our org represents around 1 in 3 Democrats who want limitations and regulations on abortion. There's about 20 million or so pro-life Democrats, and we are really honored to be a home for them and to lobby for legislation that will provide resources and support for women and parents during and after pregnancy. That's really our main focus.
Thanks. Emily?
Hi, I'm Emily. I am a friend of Rob's from college. I like to say we became friends because he used to antagonize me about feminism. But I am a leftist feminist. I live in Seattle. I don't work in any kind of like public policy field. It's just I'm a passionate feminist, and I've done a lot of pro-choice activist work in the past.
Thank you. And Hannah?
Hey, I'm Hannah Anderson. I am too a friend of Rob's, and I have zero engagement in any public policy situation. My job has nothing to do with this at all. I have become a little more tempered, I think, in my pro-life views as I've gotten older, not necessarily because I've gotten older, but just with time for various reasons, probably. So I would classify myself as pro-life, but I think it's a super, I mean, as everyone does, I'm not trying to say that I'm the only one with a nuanced view, but I think it's a super complex issue, and like I think it is ultimately ending a human life, as is murder. But I think it's a very unique situation, and I don't think it can really legally be treated the same as murder because there's this whole other person, the woman, that's involved. So that's kind of my little, TLDR.
Thanks. So how we're gonna do this is we're just gonna work through pro-life and then pro-choice, who have again already emailed Holly, but they'll give everyone a little explainer on what they would like to see on federal abortion legislation, and then we'll ask some questions. Holly will give her opinion, and that's about the spiel. So let's Jessica, why don't you go ahead and take the floor?
All right. So I thought a lot about this, and because it's now been enough time since Dobbs has come down and states have had a chance to sort of like start to sort through these issues, I've actually been really heartened to see that, some states that are, so-called red states or more conservative have actually resisted efforts to pass more restrictive abortion legislation. And I think that might have come as a surprise to some pro-lifers. So part of me feels like we should just have no federal legislation, because I would much rather have the situation where, because assuming the court would strike down any interstate travel bans. I'd much rather have a situation where people can just travel to get the care they need than a situation where we end up with a national law that is super restrictive. So that's my first thought on that. I think that, the thing about it is that like, because I'm pro-choice, I don't really want to, it would be really difficult for me to accept a compromise law, a national law that sort of, it's not that I want to impose like California's laws on the rest of the country. It's just that I would want to make it so that a federal law doesn't end up losing in the entire country some of the things that I think are important. So if I could just talk about a couple of those, like I said in my introduction, I think the heartbeat as a metric for restricting abortion is terrible. I think it's terrible ethically, because I don't think the discussion is whether, like I said, I don't think we should avoid the discussion that it is ending a potential human life. I think there are ethical concerns. I don't think any doctor should. And I think most doctors would refuse to give an elective abortion to a perfectly healthy fetus at 6th, 7th, or 8 months, or 9 months of gestation. I don't think that is like occurring. It could be wrong, but I think that the lack of nuance in what I would be called, because like abortion is not a medical term. So we really need better language, like elective termination of a viable pregnancy versus medical treatment for a no longer viable pregnancy. So if we were to have a national law, I would like it to be, I don't even know how, if this could work, but it would be nice to see like a national law that prohibited states from making certain kind of restrictions in their own laws. And most of these for me have to do with language. Like you can't say heartbeat, because that already has prevented women with no longer viable pregnancies from getting care. So like they have basically what's called a missed abortion. Like the fetus is not viable and they need medical care because there's risk of infection, and in later in term pregnancy you have stillbirth where you can't, you can't get, if you have insurance to the federal government, you can't get them to pay for your induction because it's considered abortion. So those two things, heartbeat laws, requiring states to use language that distinguish between elective termination of a viable pregnancy and medical treatment for a non-viable pregnancy. And then my third ask would be to repeal the Hyde Amendment. I just think, like I said, like if you're a federal employee, like if we accept that abortion is legal in this nation, if you get healthcare through the government, your healthcare should pay for it. That's what compromise is, I guess. So that would be sort of my my three asks. Again, I'm not really terribly optimistic that you could get that a compromise could be reached on a national level. So, but that's my take.
All right, Holly, your thoughts on some of those, or your evaluation, I guess.
Thanks, Jessica, for those ideas and expressing them very clearly. So I might take a little more time in these earlier sessions because I think a lot of the framework is going to be the same as we go down, right? Like there's going to be some repeating, and I don't want to just weigh you down with repeating what I'm saying. So the first thought is actually the most intriguing, the idea that we just leave this up to the states, which is actually kind of what the Dobbs opinion articulates. You know, we don't know what's coming down the pike, but they just kind of say this should be left up to the states. And it's a very interesting idea, and one that in this particular area is the most legally intriguing because there's a lot of need for data to support legislation and by which courts can evaluate legislation. And that's kind of what is missing a lot in some of these conversations. And one of the effects of Roe was to kind of cut off, quote unquote, experimentation in the area of abortion regulation and what actually helps women and what actually reduces abortions. And assuming that that's the goal. And so the Supreme Court, particularly Justice O'Connor, has referred to states as laboratories of democracy. And sometimes it's not enough just to say you don't like a particular policy outcome of a state, but like maybe let's let it play out and let's see how things go. So that's a particularly intriguing idea. And I think there's a lot of people that support that outcome. The trick is that you can't mandate it, right? Every 2 years we get a new Congress, and that Congress can do whatever it wants that's permitted constitutionally. So we can't put a moratorium and say no legislation on abortion, you know, like that's just gonna be a possibility every 2 years, assuming we have a functioning Congress. But it is in this particular atmosphere, a really intriguing idea. And one that I think a lot of people on both sides of this issue just want to see play out, like what actually happens when these laws are passed. Similar to that, the repealing of the Hyde Amendment is obviously something that's been brought up time to time, and the reason it comes up so often is because the Hyde Amendment is an appropriations rider. Every 2 years, at least, the federal government has to be funded. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but one, for instance, is in the Constitution, it says that the federal government can't fund the Army for longer than 2 years at a time. And you can imagine the federal government's not going to not fund the Army. So every 2 years, right, they have to issue some funding. So at least that often there's appropriations that go through Congress. And the Hyde Amendment is what's called an appropriations rider. So it's just like a limitation that's attached to this bill that funds the federal government. So it's been in existence since 1977, I think, but it's been renewed every 2 years. And it gets renewed in new forms. So it's more or less the same, but every once in a while it gets tweaked. So as of today, it requires or it prevents federal funds from being used to cover abortions, except for cases of rape, incest, or when pregnancy endangers a woman's life. So that would be, people whose insurance is funded by the federal government, or states that receive federal funds and provide Medicaid services, or any kind of social services that are enacted through use of federal funds. So oftentimes people throw around repealing the Hyde Amendment. It's been around since 1977, but it's up for renewal every 2 years. So that is always something to talk about in terms of tweaking it again or repealing it altogether. That's certainly something that's on the table and completely up to Congress. So let's see. Your other ideas about heartbeat bills and viable versus non-viable pregnancies, those are really, really important and intriguing policy issues. They're going to be hard to enact at a federal level, apart from maybe some spending limitations. So kind of big picture, the federal government, as we all know and we learned in civics, is a government of enumerated powers, so it can only do what the Constitution says it can do. So every time you have a law passed by Congress, it's got a little hook. It's like, we're acting under Commerce Clause authority, or we're acting under this authority. And so oftentimes with abortion legislation, You see the federal government claiming that they're acting under the authority to regulate interstate commerce. Something like this that is kind of vague, like if they're coming in saying, states, you may not use heartbeat as a metric, and maybe we have some really good reasons for saying that, but in terms of legislation, it's kind of hard maybe to justify under the Commerce Clause, because it seems more ethically based. They would probably have to pass a law that says, hey, states that receive federal funds, you may not take these federal funds and use them if you use heartbeats as a metric, or if you don't distinguish between elective abortions for viable pregnancies and abortions for non-viable pregnancies. So it's certainly a possibility, but I think we would see that happen more through spending, like conditioning receipt of federal funds through that, rather than just flatly prohibiting states from doing that. I think those are my thoughts on, at least preliminary thoughts. I'm happy to field any questions or clarify anything that was vague about that.
We're going to take a quick break and have a word from a sponsor. Shenandoah Coffee Roasters has been a staple of Charlottesville since 1993. They offer over 25 varieties of specialty, boutique, and gourmet coffee using only the finest Arabia coffee from all over the world. Coffee is their passion, and they painstakingly search out the best coffee available. Nothing is taken for granted as they continually strive to provide the best coffee they possibly can. They roast all their coffees to order based on the needs of their espresso bar, ensuring that only the freshest and highest quality coffee leaves their roasting house. Grab a cup at any of their 3 locations, Main Restaurant Preston, on the corner, or on Ivy Road, or order a bag online at shenandoahjoe.com. We are going to take a short break for a word from our sponsor. Today's sponsor is Cobb Technologies. Cobb Technologies is copiers and IT services local to Charlottesville, Virginia, and the #1 independent dealer in Virginia. Cobb relishes both new and existing clientele partnerships. Cobb also has a nonprofit arm which helps disadvantaged and hospitalized children. Contact local Cobb consultant Doug Woodside at 434-960-3000. Yeah, let's first does anyone have any questions, especially Jessica? Do you have any clarifying questions for Holly?
No, that was super awesome. Thank you. I learned something.
Does anyone have any questions for Jessica? Maybe why do you think this, or how do you think this would hopefully play out for her?
Can I ask? I just want to ask.
Just go for it, Walter.
Yeah, I appreciate the idea about the language behind the language behind the abortion and whatnot. Like, how, if you were to enact that or try to do that, what I don't know, if you're in California, look, I'm in Texas, it's about as deep red as you can get over here. Like, how would you want to go about, I guess in California, how do you think people would receive that? And I don't know if you've ever been to Texas, but how would you approach conservatives to be like, hey, would you consider it from this point of view of these two different terminologies?
I mean, I think that the most important thing is that we draw the distinction between what the moral motivation to intervene in a pregnancy and a medical reason to intervene. And so I think that I think I'm more concerned about medical terminology being misused to accuse women of disingenuous motives. I think that, well, or maybe a different way of putting it is that if something is legal, it has to be available. And so one of the reasons why some sort of where possible, some sort of federal legislation is desirable, at least on the terms I'm describing, is because I feel like when Roe was in effect, I don't think most women had easy access to abortion because the states were allowed to essentially regulate it out of existence, and so, or out of ease of access. So I feel like there needs to be, and this is one of the things that actually I would really interested to hear from the pro-life people on the panel about, because if we know that the vast majority of abortions take place in the early stage of pregnancy, and at least people, pro-choice people like me, admit that it's not, that the ethical, we take from the start that there is an important ethical thing at stake. where is the incentive for pro-lifers to compromise? Because like you have to go very far back in the weeks of a pregnancy to, you know, bring down the numbers of abortions. Because if you know that like well over, what is it, like, I'm going to make this up and I'm probably going to be wrong, but it's probably like overwhelmingly like a super majority of abortions take place in the first trimester.
My understanding is about 90%.
Yeah, that's the number I was going to throw out.
Yeah.
So I guess I sort of feel like we need to have like we need to have a more frank discussion. Like, are we going to accept in a pluralistic society that, you know, this care is available? And if we agree that it's legal, we make it available? I guess sort of like I would come at it from the standpoint of, yes, we agree that we disagree about the ethical stakes here. But if we're going to compromise somewhere, like I'm less concerned about where that line is. Because I mean, as we've talked about in the past, like the European laws are actually pretty restrictive in some way in terms of time. But it's much easier to find a doctor in most European countries, and excluding Italy. Italy's an exception, really. But it's not that difficult to access abortion care and prenatal care in European countries, because when they say it's legal, it's available. So
I think that's a really interesting, like, I don't know, thing to say. I can't come up with anything more clever than that. That if something's legal, it has to be available. I don't know that I would like agree with that just at first glance, I guess, because like I feel like I can think of plenty of things that are like, I don't know, this is not a good comparison because nothing ever is, but like random consumer goods that like wouldn't be illegal in America, but like you can't get. So like, I don't know, because if you say if something's legal, it has to be available, that means then like people must be forced to provide it in some proportion that is determined. Like, I don't know. I had never thought of that before, and I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with it, but like I see that obviously you can make something just like de facto illegal if you can't find it anywhere, but there's a difference between something being illegal and being guaranteed to be available, I guess. I feel like.
that's a very good point. I feel like I would never want to compel someone to do an abortion if they don't feel like, but I think that is actually a really interesting issue, because I think that goes to the issue of gatekeeping, because if you restrict these procedures because they're medical procedures to licensed physicians, et cetera, you end up sort of like running that gauntlet. Like, you know, you restrict the pool as a way of restricting availability. So I agree with you in the main.
Just to kind of ping off of what Jessica's saying, in terms of like access and availability, you know, we've seen a lot of states try to enact trap laws. Virginia was one of them that takes these very, trying to think of the word, but kind of like almost irrelevant, oh, my words are escaping me, or like irrelevant rules that abortion providers need to have. Things like width of the hallway, just really like things that are not relevant to the care, that don't make a difference in safety or anything like that. And it limits it. It severely limits access. Like when you don't have that available. And so like Jessica, you said something earlier about like people should be able to travel. Well, yeah, they should be able to, but the problem is like you get into classism and access issues because not everybody can afford to travel. Not everyone can afford to take the time off of work. So again, that's a great example of limiting access, because you have certain states that require like a waiting period where you have to go, you do the initial like consultation, and then you have to wait X amount of days. Well, for someone who, you know, is on the lower end of like the income scale, at that point, if you have to travel to another state, you're talking about taking at least 5 to 6 days off of work. That's a lot of time, and the expense of staying somewhere in the location. I mean, so I think that's what Jessica's saying about like making sure that it's available. not that it's compulsory, but that it is at least somewhat accessible to people.
Like I understand how it plays out, like limiting access. It's like, well, what's the point of it's being legal if no one can actually get it? I'm just saying how would that actually tangibly play out? Like if you can't compel people to perform abortions, like what if you're in an area where, I don't know, like none of the doctors want to do abortions? Like, how are you going to handle that? Do you have some government hired doctor that you drop in there to give an access point to abortion care? Like, I just don't know how that would actually practically play out, I guess. But like, I see y'all's point. And I think it's a really good one. I'm just trying to think through like how to get around that, I guess.
Holly, it sounded like you wanted to jump in for a moment there.
Oh, people make a really good point, so I don't want to disrupt the flow. I was thinking about the legal versus access point, and some of it is fictional, right? You can imagine a world where every doctor in a given state will not perform abortion on a moral out of moral convictions, and that is a difficult scenario, right? Like, are you going to force them to do it, and then that would obviously inhibit access. That's not the world we live in, and so maybe we just kind of take that as a given right now. And the reality is there's a lot of ways to make things illegal, and we've talked about them. And what we've seen recently are the trap laws, targeted regulation of abortion providers. And you just, try to regulate someone out of existence. We see this in business. We see this in, licensing regulations. And here we see it in a particular practice. You just really, really burden the exercise of a particular activity such that it becomes essentially non-existent. So I think that it's not true that for something to be legal, you have to have access to it. If that was true, the government would be handing out marijuana in a lot of states, and maybe that's not
or guns in Texas, right?
Or guns in Texas, right? Yeah, I mean, things can certainly be legal and rare, but that's a far cry from, I think, where we've been in a lot of states where abortion access is difficult. The access has been a result of regulation, and not a result of providers that are unwilling to provide the services. So I'm not really making an argument here as much as this is kind of a fictional conversation. Like, if we really had states that just took away the regulation, I think there would be no problem with access in today's world. And if we want to prohibit access, then we have to continue to regulate. So it's kind of reality versus theory.
So do you think that there's a way to prevent, if we were to have it, like, that's one of the things about why there's no incentive to have a federal compromise, because couldn't you have a federal law that said X, but then the states could still do trap laws? Like, it would seem like inevitably any federal compromise would have to involve some sort of like truce on the trap laws.
Well, I mean, yes and no. You'd always find people wanting to flirt with the line. But there's something in constitutional law called field preemption. And it's a weird doctrine where if Congress passes a law that kind of what they call occupies a field, we are intending to regulate access to abortion in some way. And states pass laws that also infringe on that field, that like trespass, stick a toe over the line, even if they're technically different. The courts can come in and say, under the supremacy clause of the Constitution states, you can't do that because Congress has occupied the field. So yes, of course, you're always going to find states going up to the line, trying to go as far as they can go to, exercise their sovereignty in a field that's been occupied by Congress. But ultimately, once Congress has made its will known and occupied a certain area, it becomes more difficult for states to do that under the supremacy clause.
Wow, cool. I'm learning all those things today.
That assumes a certain philosophy on the court. I mean, we're dealing with courts right now, but generally speaking, that doctrine is available to judges who are looking at these laws.
Oh, and the other thing I just might mention in passing is that a lot of these laws, like I think the Texas law was set up to like prosecute any self-abortions or anything. So that's another way in which, an area in which, you could be, the legality of like something could be permissible. Like if you couldn't prosecute someone for trying to obtain an abortion, even if it wasn't through a regulated procedure, that frees up, access possibilities. Although I suppose you could, prosecute someone who performed an abortion who wasn't a medical provider on those grounds, but so doctors, it's not only just about the medicine, like medical routes, it's about just, is it legal to do this to someone or to do it to yourself?
That was good. That was a good first round. Jess, we'll move it on to you.
Awesome. Okay, so at Dems for Life, we get this question asked so many times, and it's especially since Dobbs v. Jackson and Roe v. Wade, it's definitely been something that we talk about our org a lot. And kind of our envision is a bit twofold. And at the end of the day, we are more about, taking steps and making progress, because that's just realistically where we are where we are with our country and our culture. I mean, ideally, we would like to see a country and a culture where abortion is limited and regulated as early as possible in pregnancy, to protect all human life. And we celebrate the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the decision essentially going back to the states. And back in September, I believe, Senator Lindsey Graham proposed the Protecting Preborn Children from Late-Term Abortions Act. And the legislation would limit abortion after 15 weeks, which would bring the US more in line with Europe, which generally limits abortion to the first trimester. And I would kind of like to get Holly's view on this, about where that stands, how that would happen, especially with the courts and all the different rulings that have occurred. But we have vocally supported that. We have a press release on our website, and our main focus is, it's hard, but we want common ground, and we are really willing to work with everybody across the political spectrums, Democrat, Republican, and our org actively works with state legislators, as well as, the US House and National Congress, to really just get the legislation that we need to support women and parents, during and after pregnancy. And that's really where our main focus is, rather than, I would say, limiting and regulating abortion. Is, if we do that, even if this if a federal bill that would regulate and limit abortion after 15 weeks, as proposed by Senator Lindsey Graham, there would still be women who need resources and support. That's not gonna take it away. And I feel like that's lost in a lot of the debate and dialogue that we have, especially since Roe was overturned, is we're really missing who's really being affected. And that's women who feel like they don't have another choice because they don't have what they need to, carry and raise their children. And so that's where we are actively lobbying for that federal and state legislation to be enacted. And so at Dems for Life, we say that we're whole life, and we are constantly, every day, fighting tooth and nail to have a whole life package. And so what does whole life mean? For us, that means, we hear a really common concern oh, pro-life people are just pro-birth. And I honestly really understand that concern. And it really makes me upset. It makes our org upset when that's swept under the rug and people aren't acknowledging that. I 100% understand where that's coming from. And that's where we want this whole life package. And we actually we created our 2023 whole life agenda, where we're really going to be working with state legislators and Congress to get legislation like paid parental leave, Every Mother Matters Act, also known as Emma, which is in Arkansas, or I think Arkansas. It might be Alabama. It's one of the A states. And then, child tax credits, expanding tax relief for adoptive parents, additional funding for WIC, and, lowering the maternal mortality. So all of these issues that, impact women and, who are going through a pregnancy that is unplanned, or even, if the pregnancy is planned and they still need the resources and support to carry and raise their children. So, that's really where our focus will be as far as legislation goes. We would love to see federally paid parental leave. That's probably the one policy that we would love to see enacted. And, when women have these resources and support, we will see the abortion rate lower. And I would love to just, have to hear, different thoughts and perspectives, even from people who identify as pro-choice, of where do we stand on lowering the abortion rate? What are everyone's thoughts and opinions about that? Not even, regulating and limiting abortion, but what are steps we can take? Is there common ground on at least lowering that rate? And I actually, before Dems for Life, I worked at a nonprofit that provides financial assistance to women who seek abortion due to economic hardship. And so, we would help with their rent, we would help with their groceries, we would help, with their transportation, and we would get them connected to local resources and state aid, on in their county and state level. And what I found working there was when in certain states where these, resources and social programs were already in place, there just seemed to be a really huge disconnect of actually getting them connected. And so that's what led me to Dems for Life. And I would love to see, our state leaders, international leaders really kind of address that gap of why is it so hard to get women connected with these resources. And just from my experience of working with abortion minded women, and some women who, many of them have actually had abortions, and so being able to support them and really understand where their mindset is and where they are emotionally was such just a gut-wrenching decision, of what does that legislation look like? Basically, Dems for Life is seeking what this nonprofit did on a larger legislative scale. So that's really, oh, sorry.
Yeah. So can you kind of like boil that down into some finer bullet points for Holly, and kind of I guess concise it for the rest of us?
Yeah, sorry, that was really scattered. I'll just go off of really our whole life agenda that's on our website, because we listed certain bullet points. So like I said, paid parental leave. We would want a federal policy that provides that for, moms and dads. A lot of parents, that's a really big fear, and a lot of parents feel like they can't keep their job. Like it's a decision between, keeping their baby or keeping their job, because they lack the resources and support. So that would be one legislative piece that we would like to see on the national level. Also in Congress, they were working on the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act. And so, just providing better accommodations for pregnant workers. And we have been working with, Senator Bob Casey and, other leaders who authored that bill to address the language and address discrepancies, especially coming from like the pro-life side, and kind of understanding a lot of the nuance with the bill. So probably the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act. We would love to see the Emma bill, the Every Mother Matters Act, in all states, which essentially gives a woman like emotional support throughout pregnancy, and giving her kind of that mentorship and that counseling. I don't know if that is helping, but also additional funding for WIC, which is, if you don't know what WIC is, it's they provide, it stands for women, infants, and children, and I think it's up to 5 or 6 years old, where they can provide formula and diapers and food.
Yeah, good. I'll give it over to Holly for critique.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. So I'll talk about those in two batches. You mentioned the Lindsey Graham bill, and I'll address that in a minute. It was proposed 15-week ban. Your other policy proposals for kind of financial and employment stability for parents, particularly for pregnant people, I think are some of the more plausible actually ideas, right, in terms of politically feasible and capable of getting some bipartisan support. And from the federal level, many of them, if they were enacted by Congress, would be constitutionally sound, because there are other laws in place that more or less regulate these things, and you would just be kind of amending them and adding to those protections and requirements. I'll say two things about that. One is it matters. I know we're kind of talking in this ideal world of Congress being a functional Congress and actually passing legislation. So that would be great. Whoa, but in our world, a lot of these ideas that you're talking about actually come into being through administrative regulation. The vast majority of our federal law and the source of federal law now is not actually acts of Congress, but instead our administrative agencies are passing regulations. Those are just easier for administrations to enact. We don't really have a functioning Congress. We don't have, a filibuster-proof Senate in most instances. So it's just, that's how things get done. That's how executives, keep their campaign promises, by getting elected and trying to shoehorn things through administrative agencies and regulations. So when you talk about a lot of these ideas, like ideally, yes, they would be passed by Congress. Realistically, we're talking about, executives probably trying to make these happen through administrative regulation. And it's particularly broken right now. We're in this season where what we see is, the Trump administration passes a law, and all the Democratic states come together and find a, Democratic friendly judge in a small district where he'd be sure to hear the case, and they get him to strike down the federal regulation and issue a nationwide injunction that then goes on appeal up to the Supreme Court. And by the time it gets finished with its appeal, now we're in the Biden administration, and we have an opposite view of this. And then we have the red states, enjoining all these laws and seeking these judges who are friendly to their position and issuing nationwide injunctions. It's really ridiculous. Administrative regulation is becoming a very inefficient way to govern right now, given the way that our courts are operating. So a lot of people are thinking about these things and trying to, come up with new ways that courts can deal with them, and that, executive agencies, and deep down, we all just want Congress to function, because that would, solve this if Congress would just function. So realistically, that's what we're looking at. A lot of these policy ideas you have would more likely come through administrative regulation, which would be susceptible to all these legal challenges and just the pattern that we're in. And then a lot of employment regulation, for understandable reasons, is a little under-inclusive, because you have to regulate employers with, a certain minimum number of employees. So it's really hard for very small self-employed situations, or people who only have 5 employees, to be able to afford to, provide paid paternity leave and maternity leave. So obviously that would be better than what we have now, to have, large employers required to give those kinds of benefits. But it still would be somewhat under-inclusive, just given the realities of employers and the majority of employers in our country. But still really interesting ideas. And like I say, that they're probably among the most plausible that we'll hear today. The Lindsey Graham bill is interesting, and I'll just highlight a few things about it. One is that it's an amendment to Title 18 of the US Code. And for people who don't know, Title 18 is the criminal code. So everything we talk about in here is a crime. So a violation of this Lindsey Graham bill is going to be a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison. So just keep that in mind, like in terms of everything in there, from like record keeping to, whatever it is, it's a felony, and because this whole point of the bill is to amend the criminal code. We talked about how Congress has to have some kind of constitutional justification for acting, and so they usually put that in the bill. We are acting under this power. And Lindsey Graham in his bill says he's acting pursuant to the Commerce Clause, which I'll get to in a second. But then he also says the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. I find that very interesting because there's a debate out right now, about, regardless of the relative morality of abortion or convictions about the dignity of unborn life, really, really important questions. There's been kind of recently a presumption that unborn children, while they may have moral and ethical dignity, don't have constitutional protections. And Congress can't extend those. That would be up to the courts to find those. But this act is saying they do, that they're claiming justification under the 14th Amendment. And so that would be really an interesting and consequential interpretation if courts were to buy that. You think about if unborn children had constitutional rights, what that would mean about redistricting, IVF, IUDs, investigation of miscarriages, regulation of pregnant people in terms of diet, whether or not you have a cesarean, whether or not you undergo chemotherapy. People joke about HOV lanes, but okay, are they redistricting? Do you count unborn children in terms of jurisdiction's population, and if so, how? Child support, does that start before birth? Tax credits, and immigration. Does a pregnant person who's here and not documented by virtue of their pregnancy, are they, they get to stay? Are they, the carrier of a U.S. citizen? So, and again, not that these questions can't be answered, but the effect of extending constitutional rights to unborn children is very consequential. And so it was interesting to me to see that jump out in the Lindsey Graham law, that he was claiming justification under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and Due Process Clause. Under the Commerce Clause, he's on much stronger footing. So there was, in 2003, Congress passed a law called the Partial Birth Abortion Ban, and federal government acted to ban a particular abortion procedure. It was the dilation and extraction method, where you basically deliver a child intact before killing the child. And the federal government banned it and justified it under the Commerce Clause, saying it was an unacceptable medical procedure. And the Supreme Court upheld that in a 5-4 decision in Gonzalez versus Carhart in 2007. And it was really important to the Supreme Court in the Gonzalez case that there were other methods available, that the dilation and extraction did not, foreclose a woman's access to abortion. It was just a particular method. The method that was available as an alternative is as the D&E, the dilation and evacuation procedures. And it's actually kind of, some people in the dissent talked about how hard it is ethically to separate those two. How is one like obviously much more humane than the other? But the Supreme Court said that because this law did not extinguish a woman's access to a viable abortion alternative, that Congress, they're just going to give broad deference to Congress under the Commerce Clause to decide what medical procedures to offer or to regulate. So basically what the Lindsey Graham bill is doing is saying, hey, Gonzalez said we have broad discretion under the Commerce Clause to regulate abortion as a medical procedure. And now that Dobbs has become the law of the land, when we're no longer restricted from burdening a woman's access to abortion by virtue of this interpretation of the Constitution, therefore we can just cut it off after 15 weeks. And we can say after 15 weeks, all abortion procedures under the Commerce Clause are now illegal. So that's generally, like, as a whole, it's a much more constitutionally sound way of approaching this issue. Gonzalez specifically left open the question of what's called an as-applied challenge. So if you were a woman who needed a dilation and extraction versus dilation and evacuation procedure to save your life or health, the court said, we're not ruling on that. It might be unconstitutional as applied to certain women if that situation arose. And so that's a potential challenge, I think, to the 15-week abortion ban, where it would be a woman. This ban does exempt from criminality doctors who perform abortions to save the life of a mother. It does not exempt doctors who perform abortions to save the health of a mother. So if you're a mother whose health is in serious jeopardy, but you can't find a doctor to sign off and say for sure that your life is in jeopardy, you could probably have an as-applied challenge to this and say that your constitutional right to life is being burdened by this law, because it's hard to be a doctor and to risk committing a felony and going to, prison for 5 years on your judgment as to whether or not life versus health is in danger. So that's, potential. It also exempts rape and incest, and also abortions that are performed to extract a dead unborn child, not unviable, but a child that is already passed. It also mandates that there are to be no civil or criminal penalties for the woman, regardless of her level of participation in this. The law would not allow for civil or criminal penalties for a woman. So it's interesting. I think if we had a filibuster-proof Senate, this kind of law could be enacted, and under the Commerce Clause would probably be on decent constitutional footing, except for those as-applied challenges. And then we'd just kind of see how that would play out. But I think we'd see some challenges also, just because it says it's justified under the 14th Amendment, but because it's not only justified under the 14th Amendment, most courts would probably just kind of overlook that and be like, we're not going to rule on the fetal personhood question as long as it's constitutional under the Commerce Clause. We'll just let that one slide. But that was an interesting insertion there.
All right. Does anyone have any questions for Jess or for Holly? Or any? Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, actually, this is to Jess. So you mentioned the Every Mom Matters Act. So I actually kind of just did a little Googling about it. It looks like it's actually been proposed in a few states, including Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. And I was reading some of the language in the proposal or whatever. And what I find kind of interesting, because I agree with the premise of it, right? I think that women should get more support from the government, that that's a big problem in this discussion, that women are not afforded better healthcare, better access to healthcare, information about reproductive things. Yeah. So I guess I would be super cool with that bill if it took a more nonpartisan approach, but I've read like 3 of these now, and they all have this language. This is the one for Oklahoma. So the people who can work at those hotlines that they're proposing, because that's the proposal, that pregnant women, before they receive an abortion, have to call a hotline essentially and get a care plan offer. People who refer them to services, whether from the government or private entities, that can aid them in having a baby in a financially stable, safe, healthy manner. What I find interesting is that the people who work at this hotline cannot in the last 2 years have performed or induced an abortion, or have served as a director, board member, officer, volunteer, or employee for an abortion facility licensed by the health department, and they can't refer women to an abortion provider. So to me, that sounds almost like a crisis pregnancy center hotline, which I don't know if anybody knows about crisis pregnancy centers. You can find them pretty much everywhere. They are typically religious organizations that often will kind of market themselves as a healthcare center for women, when what they actually do is, if you go in, you say, oh, hey, I think I might be pregnant, they'll give you all this literature about keeping the baby. Oh, we'll help you with the baby. And they also give you really misleading information about the things that abortion will do, like it'll cause cancer and it'll be so detrimental to your life, which like, I'm not saying that abortion may not be detrimental to some people's lives. I know some people do regret it, but ultimately they're providing false information. And I do know this, having been to one myself. I am speaking from personal experience. Yeah, they're extremely manipulative. So I guess I'm wondering, like, do you not see how that legislation can come off as very partisan and one-sided?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up, because I didn't read I'm only familiar with the Emma in Arkansas. So I wasn't familiar with the other legislation, to be very transparent and honest with this podcast. But those are serious concerns. And I'm really glad that we're talking about this, because I myself have worked with a lot of crisis pregnancy centers in the past, and I totally understand these concerns. And I am so sorry for women who have had a very poor experience there and have felt manipulated. And I know that there needs to be reform, for lack of a better word, and regulation in crisis pregnancy centers to make sure that, like, especially if they're offering like things that would fall into the medical realm, that they're qualified and that there's the same regulations that I guess that we would have in abortion facilities. So I see it both ways, that I feel both need to be regulated. And I know that there are a lot of problems in crisis pregnancy centers. And I know it breaks my heart when I hear about a woman having a very negative experience or feeling very manipulated. That is something that cannot be brushed aside by people who are pro-life. And I honestly just have I'm speechless when I hear about those kind of stories, and I really want to do my best to empathize. And to be honest, I've worked with a lot of them, but I myself have not been to one as a woman who has been pregnant. So I will say that I don't have that experience, so I can't empathize in that matter. But I've also been to pregnancy centers who are very upfront about what they do and what they do not offer. And the ones that I've worked with, and I acknowledge that many people have not had this experience, and that doesn't discredit or minimize anybody's experience. On websites, most of the ones that I've seen have disclosed that they do not refer to abortion. And when I was working at this nonprofit, I would be upfront with the woman as well, that I just want to be clear with you that this pregnancy center does not refer to abortion, but I'm going to offer you this resource. So I think having that informed consent is extremely important, coming from the pro-life side and the pro-choice side. So I would love to see, from my understanding, Oklahoma enacted a heartbeat bill. So I'm wondering if that specific language about the hotline counselors is specific to Oklahoma.
I saw it in another, I think it might,
Yeah.
I want to say it was the Tennessee or Arkansas legislation. They all have this very similar language about who can and cannot work these hotlines. And if you have been involved in any abortion care, you absolutely cannot. Which I just find kind of interesting. Like,
yeah. I find that interesting too. It's definitely got me thinking, like, I wonder, just for a general larger question for food for thought would be, like, I feel like no matter who it is on the hotline, there's going to be somebody who's biased, right? Somebody who's pro-choice or who's pro-life. So I wonder how they would work around that from both angles.
Right. Because I mean, part of the language is that they can't even like say like, oh, well, you could go get an abort. Like, you can't even talk about it. So it's, to me, seems a little like one-sided in terms of like the offers of care. And I was going to say too, like regarding crisis pregnancy centers, highly recommend, if anyone has not seen it, the documentary 12th and Delaware, which addresses a particular crisis pregnancy center that set up shop directly across the street from a reproductive care facility that did provide abortions. I really recommend anybody who is interested in this to watch that. It's on HBO.
I'm curious, Jess, whether you have any data on how many abortions could be prevented because they're motivated by financial concerns. I mean, I think I'm perfectly comfortable saying that I think it's a tragedy that in the richest country in the world, someone would
Yeah.
get pregnant, especially in like, a marriage, and say, I can't have this baby because I can't afford it. I mean, that's sad to me. I mean, pro-choice doesn't mean that like I want people to have abortions because they
Oh,
can't have
yeah.
babies. It just means like it's the mother's decision. So I'm curious
Right.
whether you have a sense of, how effective that would be. Because I mean, ultimately, I think it would be beneficial for fewer children to grow up in poverty. So if we could get more assistance for families with children or mothers with children, I think that would be good. So of course I'd be in favor of, paid parental leave. I mean, we're basically the only industrialized country that doesn't have it.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic that could, because the reason that I'm really intrigued by your proposals, because I don't think that making abortion unavailable actually lowers rates of abortion. In fact, just makes them less safe.
I actually, really quickly, I just want to add to that there, Amnesty International has some data on that. And in countries where abortion is like practically illegal, 37 out of 1,000 women get abortions. And then in countries where it is more accessible, it's 34 out of 1,000, which doesn't sound like that big of a difference. But when you consider the numbers, it does actually make a pretty big difference.
Yeah, I believe Denmark, one of those North European countries, I'm pretty sure Denmark, it's either Denmark or Netherlands. It's one of those two, have like the lowest abortion rate in the world. And not that they're like super strict, although I think they're pretty normal for Europe. At around like 20 weeks, abortion is more or less banned, but I think they just have really good access, really good healthcare, really good early education, probably awesome paid family leave. But yeah, I think generally Emily's right. I can't speak to the numbers, but I know the country with the lowest abortion rate in the world is in Europe.
Yeah. And as far as I'm concerned too, is the lack of data, especially accurate data, it's so hard to find. Like just, it's really tough. And as far as, poverty and abortion, I'm just going off of 2 studies, and because there's so many different studies, I really just like it's kind of hard to pinpoint. But I know one from Guttmacher found that 76% of women seek abortion due to economic hardship. And there was something highlighted in a Forbes article, like a data and study done by a college professor that found, I want to say it was 59% or 60% of women who seek abortion are at or below the poverty line. And so that's where we come in of poverty, at Dems for Life, we believe, and I think not just our org, I think a lot of people probably follow this, is, poverty should not be a barrier to pregnancy and parenting. And so that's really where our org wants to step in with lobbying for, legislation that will give parents resources and support during and after pregnancy. And I just know I just speaking from my own experience with the org, that was very, that had a specific mission with helping with providing financial assistance to women seeking abortion because of economic hardship. So I'm speaking from that point of view of when women had, and we would provide that financial support during and after pregnancy. And they felt confident to keep their baby with that support. And it went more than that. We would get them connected with, their state aid if they weren't already, and other organizations. So they, as soon as our support ended, we were upfront by saying we're not a permanent solution, but we want to help you get on your feet and let you know that economic hardship does not have to be a barrier. And getting them paired up with financial counseling and support that they would need after the baby's born. And then there's also the side of it, as I live in California, and our state has, as far as my understanding, we have really good healthcare. I mean, I don't pay anything for my healthcare. And there's really good labor laws in our state, but we have one of the highest abortion rates in the nation. So kind of understanding that gap of economic hardship and poverty of why is the abortion rate so high? And I would love to get, at least on the state level, getting more of that statistics, because I haven't been able to find them, of really kind of pinpointing why that's the case.
Sounds good. We'll move it over. We'll keep moving along. Move it over to Emily.
So I'm gonna like preface this with, I know that these proposals are wishful thinking and they are coming from someone who is like more left than Bernie Sanders. So I just want to say that out up front.
And we will just go ahead and bracket that with Holly's continual refrain of, if we had a functioning Congress.
Yeah, because there's no Speaker of the House right now. So
my bet is we won't have one next week. That's my bet.
I think you're right. Based on some interviews I've seen, I think you're correct. Okay, so I'm just gonna like read through my bullet points real quick. Bear with me. So federally guaranteed access to abortion up to 16 weeks. States could expand this as they see fit, but not place further limitations. And federal protections for abortion at any time when it endangers the health of the mother or is the result of rape or incest. States could not prosecute someone who goes out of state to receive an abortion at a later term than allowed in their state of residence. No more trap laws. Repeal the Hyde Amendment. Make the abortion pill part of the ACA class of medications that insurance cannot charge a copay for, like similar to what they did with birth control, and make it available via telehealth, which actually the FDA, I believe, just did. So now you can, I know there's some states, and I'm not sure which, I live in Seattle, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the case here, that you can, similarly to like Plan B, you can just go to the pharmacy and get the abortion pill. And then nationwide mandatory comprehensive sexual education, at least in public schools or schools that do not have religious affiliation, that also teaches abstinence. And I'll be honest, I'm throwing a bone there because I don't think we should necessarily be like focusing on that. But it teaches both abstinence and pregnancy/STD prevention. So that's like realistic sex education that recognizes that teenagers are going to have sex. We might as well like tell them the safe way to do it. And then mandatory minimum 8 weeks paid maternal and paternal leave, out-of-pocket cost cap for hospital births, and federally funded prenatal classes that are like available to anyone, regardless of your income. You can sign up for it and go. And yeah, so again, I know all of this is really wishful thinking, but that's my thoughts.
Sorry, just when you said the 8 weeks, I was like, oh, yeah. So I used to be a plumber, and we when we had our third daughter, the guy I worked for, good guy, believer, and he was like, hey, I wish I could give you a whole year off like the Old Testament talks about, but we'll see you in a week. And I was like, I appreciate the week.
I had a friend who had his first child a couple years ago, and he worked as a mechanic, and they gave him 3 days off.
Oh yeah,
just like that's it.
Look, in some of these old school places or careers, is like, yeah, congratulations, we'll see you at work tomorrow.
Oh no, I know. I'm from Virginia. I know.
Oh,
it's
yeah,
just
okay.
It is wild. It's
Yeah.
like, wow, that's it.
I work for the government and I get 0 paternity leave.
That doesn't, and it's, it's funny though, because I bring this up with my dad a lot. We'll have this conversation, and he's always like, oh, the guys aren't going to do anything. They're just going to like stay home and like do side projects. And I'm like, they can help the mom. That's what they can do.
Yeah, maybe the mother would like appreciate a little bit of a nap.
Or maybe you can do everything that the mom was
Yeah.
already doing, and so she can just keep the child alive.
Imagine.
And also, a father is a very valuable figure also, and that relationship is also important.
And I would like to say that my dad is like a very stand-up human being. He just is a boomer,
Oh, boomers.
All right. Well,
but Holly, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
We'll try
Oh, no, that's true. And the other thing that I've seen a lot of couples do now that actually have access to the paid leave is stack it. So if both mom and dad get 8 weeks, that is like 4 months of the child's life before you're paying for daycare or having to like, yeah, it's a great thing when it's available for sure. I really like how detailed it is, and also assuming a functional Congress, how actually kind of doable it is because it builds off of other kinds of policies. So, up to 16 weeks, health of the mother, rape or incest, exceptions, those are largely ones that can be justified under the Commerce Clause under existing regulations. So assuming Congress can pass it, they could say, this is the now the national standard and kind of preempt state laws in that way. Courts can go where they're going to go, but I think based on existing precedent, there are strong arguments for that kind of justification on some kind of healthcare provision. Out of state abortion prohibition, I think, even in the Dobbs opinion, we saw some signaling from Justice Kavanaugh that that would be unconstitutional under just kind of a basic right to travel. Or there's also this put you to sleep, but interesting legal doctrine called the Dormant Commerce Clause, where because Congress can regulate interstate commerce, states, even if Congress hasn't acted, states can't burden interstate commerce because it's like the sleeping commerce clause. Congress could act if it wanted to, so the dormant commerce clause. Justices Gorsuch and Thomas don't believe in it. They don't think there is a dormant commerce clause. There's this interesting case pending from the Supreme Court that has to do with animal welfare regulation out of California. And we're expecting to see some opinions come down from the Supreme Court, and Justices Thomas and Gorsuch will likely say there is no dormant commerce clause. But the majority of the court believes it exists, and so I think out-of-state regulations would likely be found to be unconstitutional as a violation of kind of a basic right to travel or of the Dormant Commerce Clause. The trap laws would be harder because we call them trap laws because of the intent behind it. States couldn't outlaw abortion, but they were trying to without being found to violate Roe. So they're more like intent laws or laws that look to us to be not rationally related to legitimate healthcare provisions, but instead ones meant to make it more burdensome to obtain an abortion. It's possible to federally legislate to make those harder to pass, but I think it would be hard to just have a no trap law prohibition, right? Like, because it's hard to define those. But I think you could have like piecemeal, like states, you may not, treat abortion facilities differently than other, outpatient surgery centers or whatever it is. Like you could get at that potentially, but it would be hard to just have a law saying no more trap laws. But I get what you're going at there. We've talked a little bit about repealing Hyde, totally doable if they want to do that. The abortion pill, medications, telehealth, I mean, obviously all in the works. Those all tend to be, and rightly should be, operations of administrative agencies. So, there's a lot of problems that come with agency law in our country. They're not as directly accountable democratically, and they have these procedures they have to follow, and their regulations tend to get caught up in the courts, like we've talked about. So it's problematic. But the one thing I will say for agency regulation is you tend to get, career civil servants that have isolated areas of expertise. So, I kind of joke and say, do you want, and I don't mean offense to her necessarily, but, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Marjorie Taylor Greene, voting on whether a vaccine is safe or not, right? You just, and I don't mean to insult either of their intelligence when I say that. I just mean I don't want individual members of Congress to be making those kinds of expertise-laden decisions. So similarly with what pills need to be included in healthcare plans, what medication should be accessible by telehealth versus requiring, inpatient physical appointments before prescription, et cetera, those are the kinds of things that would come through administrative regulations more likely than through acts of Congress, which would make them susceptible to all the administrative regulation challenges and traps and stuff. But obviously we see them come through and they could be upheld, and the vast majority of our federal law is administrative regulation. So it's certainly a possibility. And again, the comprehensive sexual education as well as prenatal care. would probably come through funding. You would just attach federal funds to local organizations that would provide those services. So states could opt out, but the federal government could try to make it very attractive by funding those services in states. But certainly possible. That's the kind of thing that the federal government does all the time to try to incentivize states to do certain things by attaching federal funds to it. So yeah, very exhaustive list. And if we get a functioning Congress, maybe they can take up some of these things. But these are the kind of laws, the kind of discrete laws, I think realistically at some point in time, you could see coming down the pike.
Thanks. Does anyone have any questions for Emily or clarifications from Holly?
Yeah, now that we're talking about the Hyde Amendment, I just, from Holly's very legal expertise, where does this fall in line, I guess, with, because I'm Catholic. So as far as taxpayer funding of abortion goes, where does that kind of fall with, religious liberty? And also, I guess, for doctors who maybe work at Catholic hospitals and feel very morally conflicted and compromised about providing or performing abortion. And I guess, about taxpayers who are concerned about that and that violating like religious liberty. I would like to hear that kind of viewpoint and understanding of where that would fall.
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, sorry, Emily.
Oh, well, I just really quickly wanted to kind of on the religion or like taxpayer concern argument. I mean, I'm opposed to war. My tax dollars still go to that. So, I mean, that's a whole rabbit hole we could go down. But I mean, there are many things our government does that I absolutely think are horrible and morally wrong. But I exist in this country and that's just how it is, I mean, would I like to see a change? Sure, but I'm trying to be realistic. Anyway, Holly, please.
Oh, yeah, no, more or less that's true. So it's a great question, Jess. So what we're looking at constitutionally when we talk about those things is you say, I have the right to the free exercise of my religion and the government can establish a religion. So those are the two parts of the First Amendment that kind of are at play here. And kind of like Emily said, the fact that our taxpayer dollars go to things that we would not do as an exercise of our religion or that we find morally objectionable is not generally enough to trigger a First Amendment violation. It would be impossible.
Because everybody would get religion then.
Well, right. It would just be impossible. I mean, our federal government does all sorts of things that half the country thinks is immoral or a violation of their religion. So it is true that the Hyde Amendment was passed as a legislative act, not a constitutional provision, but a legislative act saying we don't want people who are morally opposed to abortion to have to know that their taxpayer dollars are funding abortions. And so that's why we're going to attach this rider to the appropriations bill. So it's different for something to be a rationale for a legislative act than for it to be constitutionally mandated. So I think it's not constitutionally mandated that our taxpayer dollars don't go to something that we find morally objectionable. I feel like there's another part to your question, and I apologize. It's 10:30.
Oh, yeah. It might be the same, kind of fall into the same scope, but I guess, doctors that work at Catholic hospitals.
Oh, yes. Yeah, now that would. So repealing the Hyde Amendment would not force individual doctors to perform abortions.
Yeah. I guess that was a separate question outside of Hyde.
Yes, and I think under current court precedent, you would absolutely find free exercise protections for doctors who don't want to perform abortions or find that to be a violation of their religious principles. So that would be different, though, than a taxpayer saying, my religious liberty is violated by the federal government using my taxpayer dollars for something that I find to be morally objectionable, is a different argument than I can't be forced as a doctor to actually affirmatively do something, an abortion, that I would find to be a violation of my religious practice. So I think under current court precedent, those would be two very different questions and they would come out different ways.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for clarifying. I've always wondered that.
All right. I think we'll give it over to Hannah for one last round.
Oh boy. Thanks, Rob. Okay, so I appreciated, Emily, that you just went like bullet point by bullet point, because I did not think about this in like paragraph form. I have like a smattering of things listed in a Google Doc, so I'm just going to kind of go through this as best I can. So I'll start with, I guess, kind of my main thoughts going into this exercise, which were the following. Abortion is ending a human life. I think that that's just the fact. Like, I think it's kind of futile to argue about like, when does life start? Is it at this week or this day, or when this physiological change happens, or whatever? I kind of think regardless of when it happened, like I guess I think it begins at conception. So I think it's really hard for us to determine, like, based on some arbitrary thing, when life begins. So I think that abortion ultimately is ending a human life, but my second thought on that is that I don't think, as I kind of said in my little intro, that you can just legally equate it to normal murder, because they're very different situations. In normal homicide, usually, like, if you choose not to kill your victim, you just keep on rolling with your life, and your life is not affected by your choice to not kill this other person. Whereas an abortion situation, the two options are a little bit more like, in my point of view, kill the other person, in this case, the unborn child or the fetus. And that allows you to then continue on with your life, or don't kill the other person, but your life is drastically affected in that situation. So it's not really, I guess my final wrapping up thought on that is that it's not really just like, oh, it's just the woman's body, and so long as the child is still inside the woman's body, it's just a question of bodily autonomy. Nor is it just, oh, well, the unborn child has all these rights, and so we have to, treat them as we would any other person. They both have a certain amount of weight, and it's really, really hard to say that one person's like rights outweigh the others. So I think it's just a really, difficult situation to try to figure out some kind of like balance in the middle of something that gives some weight to the unborn child and some weight to the mother, and doesn't, do too much damage to either one, because it's just it's a really difficult situation. Like, there's no one easy, clear answer. So that's kind of my preliminary little spiel. In terms of thinking through this legally, I do not have a degree in political science. I am not a lawyer. So I don't know how these would play out, but in an attempt to think through this, I think that abortion should be legal during early pregnancy, first trimester. Sure. I don't know. That seems like a reasonable place. I think you have to, again, kind of just strike a balance somewhere, like attribute some respect to the dignity of human life and say that this is a human life. So snuffing it out at any point isn't really, I don't think that that's like, I don't know. Like, there's something special about life. And I think you need to recognize that like life has dignity. So, I think you need to, give some leeway to situations that are going to arise where an abortion is necessary for whatever reason, whether that is because, the mother will absolutely die if the abortion isn't performed, or just because the mother is just not prepared to have the kid. I think that abortion should be pretty freely legal very early on. Let's see. And I think then that after that, first early chunk, whether that's the first trimester or 15 weeks or however many, I think that it should continue to be legal in cases of rape. I think, though, that raises the question of like, how do you regulate that? Like, do you have to have mandatory reporting within a certain amount of time? Like, how do you ensure that this sounds really horrible to talk about, but like, how do you ensure that it's a legitimate like abortion due to rape and not just like someone who missed the first trimester deadline and is trying to get an abortion later than is legal? I think that's a really tricky, like, I don't have a good answer to that. I think that's just a tricky situation. I think it should be legal after the first trimester for minors. Maybe. I think you can't adopt a kid if you're 15, and I kind of feel like you shouldn't have to have a kid at 15. Again, though, like, it raises questions because it's like, okay, do we as a society teach our teenagers that there are zero consequences for their actions ever? Like, until you're 18, you can just do whatever you want, and society will always, deal with the consequences for you, or like, you won't have to really deal with anything, that's long lasting. I don't think that's really a good, like, not to just be like pedantic about it, I don't think that's a good like lesson, I guess, or a good practice. And I think that also completely throws away the idea that life does have dignity. Like, even if it's a 15-year-old's unborn fetus, there's still something there that's valuable. Just moving right through my bullet points. Yeah, I mean, continue to be legal after the first trimester if there's the danger to the health of a mother. If that danger wasn't present until later. Again, like, I wrote here, how do you regulate that though? And yeah, we kind of have talked about this a little bit. Like, do you just have like a federal list of conditions where it's like, if you qualify for one of these, then you can get an abortion, or do you leave it up to individual doctors to just determine that on their own? I don't really know. So that's what I think in terms of when it should or shouldn't be legal. In terms of like restrictions, I guess, that should be in place surrounding abortion in general. We talked earlier about waiting periods, like a mandatory delay. And I think it maybe was Emily who brought this up. I don't remember if it was you, Jessica. This has been a long and fluid conversation, so forgive me if I'm mixing people up. Talked about how, this can cause hardship for women who live in like remote areas, and they have to, potentially take a long time off of work because maybe they have to drive 12 hours away for the first visit and then drive 12 hours away again 2 weeks later or whatever for the second visit. And it's a huge issue. So I think, frankly, a waiting period is a good idea in practice, in theory. I think what we're running into is an issue like with practice, because of what about people who live in remote areas? Like, the issue isn't necessarily with the waiting period. The issue is with the ripple effects of that in terms of, financial hardship or whatever. So is there a way that we could like work around that? Can we, I don't know. I don't know how the government works. So I don't know if these are good ideas. These may be terrible ideas, but can the first visit maybe to be to someone who's not actually an abortion provider, who's like the local doctor, that maybe is more of that like counseling type of visit. And then it's like, okay, I know that you want this, wait up 2 weeks or whatever, and then go get the abortion at this place that is further away. Could the government like subsidize home visits or something like for that first visit so that the woman wouldn't have to take off so much work? I don't know. But I guess I think that the waiting period is not a terrible idea. It's just making it be practicable. That is an issue. And I feel like just throwing money at that problem could help with that. Other things. So if we say, I guess, that it's illegal in certain situations, like, what does that actually mean? Like, if it's illegal, does that mean that it is a crime? And if so, like, is it criminally prosecuted? And if so, how is it criminally prosecuted? Obviously, like, there's all sorts of terrible stories of, like, women being prosecuted because they had a miscarriage. And like, that's gruesome and atrocious. And I think that shouldn't I think that that's not a loving way to treat people. I think that's a bad thing. So, but if it's illegal, like there has to be some kind of consequence. Otherwise, what does that mean? So I think that you would never be able to prosecute the woman for getting an abortion, because I think that that would maybe help to close off the risk of an accidental miscarriage being investigated as an illegal abortion. I think you would only ever have to criminally prosecute the abortion providers. So that's, I guess, that thought. I don't know with what, like jail time, a fine. I don't really know what's reasonable in terms of a deterrent without, like, if you imprison, the abortion doctor, that's also going to remove a lot of access to abortions and also just normal healthcare. That's not abortions. But there needs to obviously be some kind of consequence if we're going to say that certain cases like abortion is illegal. So, and then my final little section here is pretty in line. A lot of this is really in line with what Jess was talking about in terms of kind of whole life ideas. I think, like, I don't know, I just moved from, France, which is a socialist paradise. So we, healthcare is free and wonderful and abundant over there. And so are things like parental leave. And I think that it's a discouraging situation that a lot of potential parents find themselves in this country when they look at, like, okay, I'm not going to be able to take any time off because I just had a kid, whether I'm a mother or a father. What am I going to do with the kid afterwards? Where's my free childcare? Like, how am I supposed to handle this? Access to mental health care early in pregnancy, throughout pregnancy, and post-pregnancy. I think open access, to Plan B. I think it's often pointed out that pro-life people are, like, not in favor of birth control or things that would prevent an abortion from ever being needed in the first place. And, like, I agree that, like, maybe in an ideal world, some idealistic, unreal world, like, we wouldn't need to be having these conversations about how we should have all this free access to birth control, but, like, teenagers are going to have sex and people are going to have sex, and that's not really my issue to deal with. And so I think the important thing is helping keep people safe and ensuring that the question of whether or not to get an abortion never has to arise in the first place. So that's me.
Great, I'll jump in. Thanks, Hannah. I'm going to go kind of big picture with these because maybe some of my particular responses we've touched on before, but I think you bring up a lot of good points on the limitation of positive law. So one would just be your nuance point. You're expressing that your views on abortion are nuanced. And I think one of the interesting things is that, we have a lot of different opinions just on this Hollywood Square arrangement right here, that and anywhere you go, people are going to have different opinions. But I think one thing that's come out in the polling is that most people's opinions are nuanced. So the absolutists on abortion in our country are actually very much a minority. And one thing that happened as a result of Roe in 1973 was that states that were more pro-life or majority pro-life could pass laws with no consequences. They knew they would be illegal under Roe. And so they could just kind of compete with each other for who was the most pro-life. And in doing that, they touched on an important element in the law, and that is the kind of, like, teaching value of the law. Like, law isn't just, out there to regulate, but it actually kind of instructs. The existence of law is important. And so they wanted their laws to instruct and to be symbolic. But now that Roe is not the law of the land, these laws actually have consequence. It actually matters what the cutoff for abortion access is, or what the standard for life and health of the mother is, or all of these things. Like they've always mattered, but like they particularly matter now that these laws are potentially viable, now that Roe is no longer a barrier to that, and that the courts are no longer a barrier to that. Similarly, we law and morality are not completely separate, but neither are they completely the same. And so things that are illegal are often immoral, and rightly so. And things that are immoral are often illegal, and rightly so. But there are many things that are deeply moral in terms of people's personal convictions that can't be illegal or shouldn't be illegal. And oftentimes it's because they're things that are very, very close to home, very intimate. So when you think about deeply moral decisions about who you partner with in life or how you raise your children, typically speaking, those are autonomous decisions that the government just doesn't really get involved in, even though they're deeply moral and deeply influential. For several years, I was in private practice and I represented children in the court system as a guardian ad litem. And I would see the conduct of parents that are deeply, deeply moral and deeply, deeply hurtful, permanently so, but perfectly legal because it was in this kind of intimate sphere of existence. So when we talk about abortion laws, I think we really struggle with that in terms of, we don't want to be probably investigating every woman who suffers a miscarriage criminally, sending detectives into their home, flashing badges just to make sure, right? Like we don't want to do that. And yet we know that women can self-induce miscarriages, and many miscarriages could be, potentially illegal under restrictive abortion laws. So these are, I'm just kind of like going big picture here. Like it's not possible for our positive laws to capture all immoral behavior. And nor would we want it to be so, probably, in a perfect world. You talked about waiting periods, and states can enact those, and they have, and they've even been upheld, and even under the Roe regime, we could see the federal government doing that. I think health of the mother, life of the mother exceptions and waiting periods, they would be subject mostly to what I call the as applied challenges, which is, if you were a victim of domestic abuse and did not want the father of the child knowing that you were pregnant, and, a waiting period might be very different for you than for someone else. Or if you were a minor, you didn't want your parents knowing you were pregnant, maybe because a parent is the father of the child, in those really like extreme situations. And I know they're not the majority of abortions, but you can think of applied challenges where the waiting period as applied to that particular person would be extremely onerous. And maybe those exceptions can be built into the law. But similarly with the life of the mother exceptions, like I said, there's a spectrum between life and health. And if you put criminal penalties on the doctor, where he lands in terms of, or she lands in terms of willingness to provide medical care, certifying life versus health, and putting at risk not just your medical license, but your actual freedom. And that could be really in individual instances on an as applied basis, that could be a way to challenge those laws. And I think we'll see some of those cases working through the courts in some of the states that are enacting these laws. And then finally, you mentioned the woman versus doctor prosecution. Really interesting, because I think we do see a fairly, not non-existent, but low political will to prosecute women. And I understand that impulse entirely. And so most of the focus has been prosecuting the facilitators of abortion, whether they're medical service providers or other people who help facilitate them. The interesting thing is the level of criminality or civil penalties that we associate with it. And this is something where data should be gathered, because it's not a purely legal question. But when we think about the purposes of criminal law, one of the purposes is deterrence, right? We talk about rehabilitation, we talk about deterrence, and we talk about all these other reasons why we have criminal law. And so I kind of, when I'm teaching criminal law, I kind of joke that deterrence only works with certain groups of people. So if you tell me it is now, a crime in Virginia to have a phone in your hand while you're driving, it actually does deter me because I'm kind of a rule follower. So I understand it was never a good idea to have a phone in your hand, but I put it up. I have one of those little brackets now. I don't hold it while I'm driving because I don't want to get pulled over and be fined for that. But it's just a fine. Like I'm not going to get locked up for it. So I'm not like super deterred. I'm just deterred. But I don't need a law that says I shouldn't murder somebody to be deterred. That actually doesn't really work for me. I know that the existence of the law is not what deters me from committing murder. So similarly, I think you see with most, professionals, medical professionals, whether you're talking about taking their license or whether you're talking about fining them or whether you're talking about locking them up for a misdemeanor term of up to 12 months, or whether you're talking about, in some cases, I've seen some proposed legislation that's like, life sentence, death penalty eligible, basically, for performing abortions. That's all highly deterrent in terms of women's access to abortions because you're dealing with a population that would be, in most cases, deterred by those. And if not, you're talking about real, zealots who are willing to risk everything to provide this kind of care. So it's important where that comes down, but in some ways, in terms of women's access to abortion, it doesn't matter that much whether we're talking about fines, medical licenses, or actual incarceration, because you're probably effectively deterring those people who would be the targets of enforcement, regardless of where you place the punishment. But again, that's kind of my speculation. It'd be interesting to see some data on that. But just as somebody who works in criminal law and kind of sees the people who are deterred and aren't deterred and from what, it's an interesting rationale for rules. And my suspicion is that medical professionals would be in a highly deterred category, regardless of where you place the illegality.
I think we've already seen that, and I think certainly Roe proved that because I mean, and I wonder if we could like a super like easy small step to federal law would be to prevent the criminalization of because we've been talking a lot about like what's the difference between making something legal and making something available, like, and of course while the ethical comparison is not correct, the legal comparison might be. It was like when we're talking about marijuana, how like it's not legal to offer it for sale and it's not legal to purchase it, but it is legal to grow and to have it. I could imagine a regime where you could not advertise legally, like you could not legally offer an abortion, but it's not criminal in the sense to procure one or to self-induce one. Because I think I watched the documentary The Janes about the group of women who provided abortions, like procured and then eventually moved on to themselves learning how to do abortions for women in Chicago. And this is obviously pre-Roe. And as soon as New York State legalized abortion, they didn't pay for any more abortions like illegally in Chicago. They just flew everyone to New York. I mean, they were basically like United's amazing best customer because they would just pay for the tickets to send women to get legal abortions. And that speaks to the deterrence effect. It wasn't that they didn't know how to do abortions or procure abortions where they were. It was that if they could alleviate the legal risk that they were taking by putting the patient somewhere else, they wanted to do that because it was the only difference in the care. I mean, I guess you could argue in some cases, competence or level of safety, but like the main difference between the situation they had created in Chicago and what was happening in New York was legality. And I think we've and like part of the issue with the safety of like the desperation of women who really don't want to carry a pregnancy, who get pregnant and do not want to carry the child to term, like that is going to remain constant. So the other things in the mix then, depending on the legal environment, and the more illegal it is, the more you're going to be dealing with actors who are motivated by money and not deterred by illegality. And that is like a not great mix when it comes to the safety of women. So, I mean, I'm not even necessarily sure, like, one of my main worries is the criminalization. Like, I think a law, like even a 10 or 6 week ban in a state where you could where that care was available would not concern me so much as like a law like Texas, which basically criminalizes it. Because that's so dangerous. That's just asking for like the most exploitative actors to come into that space. So I think really a lot of what we're talking about is we're talking about morality, but we're also talking about like, gatekeeping, like who can sell what under what terms. And also like, I've thought a lot about how, this issue has become politicized. And I feel like if we were to not having Roe, I think has the opportunity to depoliticize this issue, because then a state can't say abortion is legal here because it has to be legal here. They get to say abortion is legal here because we as a state, the people who live here, the people who vote here, agree with this compromise. And that's really important because abortion, because of Roe, I think largely abortion became exclusively economically driven by partisan interests. And I think that's really bad for women. I think that's why you see so many local doctors unwilling. Like, why is abortion a specialty care thing? It's not actually that medically complicated in early pregnancy. So it became a specialty service because of its politicization. Because in a red state, you got all this credit for saying, I'm against abortion, I won't do abortions. That doesn't actually help women. So if like XYZ red state is going to say abortion is legal to 6 weeks, well, maybe we could see doctors, obviously if you're morally against it yourself, fine. But I think that there's a strong deterrence effect just based on sort of like the public pressure to appear, against abortion. I think the provider environment might change if some of the like political rhetoric was brought down. I think overturning of Roe has the potential to do that. At least I would hope so.
Just to kind of ping off of that, if you don't mind, in 12th and Delaware, actually, there is, and I want to say this is the kind of documentary where there's no commentary. It's just filming. They're just filming these people doing their thing. The doctor that works at the facility that does provide abortions literally has to like park in a parking lot miles away with like sunglasses and a hat on. A different person will pick him up depending on the day, take him to the facility. They have to go in like into a garage, like a secure garage, and like it has to close before he can even like take his hood off and get out of the car because of the politicization and the public pressure. So, I mean, who was it? Tiller, who was like shot or got a bomb thrown into his house. I mean, abortion doctors are like very targeted by the extreme right wing. Like that's a fact. They kill them. So absolutely. I think that's a huge issue. But also, I mean, if we're going to talk about the politicization, I mean, abortion, and I know I talked about this last time on the podcast, abortion was not an issue politically in America until the 19th century, when male doctors were tired of midwives taking their money and started proposing all of these, like abortion was not a big deal up to the quickening, or like when you could like feel the baby move. No one cared. I mean, at least like not at a political level. It was just not a big deal. It was just something that was done. And I think you're absolutely right that the politicization is a huge problem. with this discussion and with abortion in general, because it's just healthcare. That's what it is. Like, and the fact that we're trying to quantify it morally, I think is, I mean, I know we're not all going to agree on that, but it's interesting to see like this particular aspect of healthcare be taken in that direction.
I also wanted to say something to Hannah's point about consequences to your actions. I think that's a really astute point, and I actually am one of the first people who was willing to argue that that the legalization of abortion actually had a social effect of letting men off the hook, which I don't think was actually very beneficial to children at all. I think that the idea that if the man, like, as I said, like morally, I'm very pro-choice, but socially, as a social pragmatist, I think that there's something to be said for the fact that if you get a woman pregnant and you know that the socially, legally, whatever, the woman is not going to abort, then you're going to be like, you're going to take that, you're going to think about that. You're going to think, I'm creating a life, I'm responsible. Whereas I think the social, in many cases, the social message now is, well, it's the woman's body, it's her choice. So I can take it, or, I can just be out of the picture and she can have the baby if she wants to, which is not a social calculation that existed like even 2 generations ago. That was just not a social calculus. Like a man who impregnated a woman, and like, I mean, my husband, who's significantly older than me, like grew up in an environment where like, it was just like, that was what they were taught, was like, there were absolutely consequences, and the consequences included the fact that, you break it, you buy it. I mean, that's a really shame. Like I don't mean it like that, but you get the idea. Like very simplistic 1 + 1 = 2 consequence kind of level social responsibility. And yeah, I'm like totally a political homeless weirdo because I believe in like social consequences and I'm pro-choice. So I'm weird. But it's definitely like, ugh. Yeah, it's complicated, but it's also, I'm the first person to admit that, if we have this idea that a woman, it's only up to the woman, we've created this sort of niche, I mean, it seems like you can't even say, well, why does the government have to provide for women? Shouldn't the fathers also provide for women? So, it's hard.
I want to make sure Jess and Hannah can say one last thing, and then I'd like, if Holly would like to say one last thing, before we wrap up. So I think Jessica and Emily have said some stuff. I didn't know if Hannah or Jess would like a word or two before we wrap up in the next few minutes.
No, I think I'm good. I just loved listening to this very thought-provoking, I don't know if that's the right word, conversation and dialogue, learning a lot about, especially having Holly on to kind of clarify things from an unbiased view of the legal standpoints.
Yeah, I mean, this has been, a super interesting way to spend a Thursday night. So thank you all. I'm making it sound like I'm the host, which I'm not. No, but for real, I mean, I think it's rare that we get to have like conversations like this that don't devolve into a lot of like annoyed looks and tones and comments and things like that, and then you never call that friend again and you disinvite them from everything. So this was it was nice to be able to hear a variety of perspectives from y'all. So I don't know, I could probably talk more, but I think I'll just leave it at that.
I want to pose one question to Holly, and this will neutral. Do you think there will ever be any sort of federal election or federal abortion bill in, let's say, in this 118th Congress? Do you think that will be able to get passed in the next 2 years, or do you think it will even be able to get passed in the next 4 to 6? Well, on any level, whether it's pro-choice, pro-life, even, or somewhat of a happy compromise even. Do you think anything that has basically, this is a federal abortion bill, do you think that will be able to get past Congress in the next 2 to 6 years?
No, not without abolishing the filibuster, which maybe they'll do. I don't know, but I don't think. I think it's still such a highly partisan issue, which actually, we've talked a lot about federal legislation, but that actually clears up some time due to the gridlock of the federal government for states to experiment with legislation and see what happens. But yeah, who knows, right? I don't have a crystal ball, but I just think politically that's not feasible if you require supermajority for legislation. Now, the one exception to that might be, we've been talking about the Hyde Amendment or things like that. Those are appropriations riders, which are outside the filibuster. So if they don't abolish the filibuster, you might find some funding appropriation style federal legislation, but nothing really substantive.
Easiest way to kill something is say you must do it and then never fund it.
Okay, yeah. So I don't know, but it's an interesting conversation to continue to have, and I appreciate everyone's respectfulness, and I appreciate the comment from an unbiased view. I'll just clarify, I'm not unbiased. I try to talk about it from a legal perspective, but the law is not unbiased, and I'm not unbiased. But
well, I was trying to say, so far you have not shown any cards, or you have shown very little cards on your own, pro-life, pro-choice, and I won't ask you that, but I just wanted to try to insinuate that here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And the reason for that is not that I'm ashamed of my views or whatever. It's more just I don't feel like I have particular expertise in that area, right? Like it is a really, really complicated subject and very morally fraught. And I have fairly intense personal convictions in a lot of the different areas that affect this. But in terms of sharing those, I don't feel like I have a particular expertise, or that my opinion on those should be weighted more heavily than anyone else's. So I kind of shy away from leading with that. But obviously, as we're talking about actual law and legislation and the way it could work through the courts and the different kinds of doctrines and things like that could come up, like I know a little bit about that, so I'm happy to talk about that. So I appreciate you inviting me on here, and everybody else for this very respectful, interesting conversation.
Everyone,
if we were Congress, we actually probably could pass law. Rob, do you want to be speaker?
No.
I vote for Rob. I vote for Rob as speaker.
Oh, well, thank you.
And that's me. That's me saying this.
Well, I could say many things about current or past speakers, but I will just say thank you. And from what I've heard, that is just a hellish job that burns you out super quick. So I like not having gray hair yet, but thank you. And thank you all for coming on, taking your time for this, and thank you so much, ladies. Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.